The door burst open before Adeline could even set down her teacup, and her father's voice filled the room like a clap of thunder. "You are to marry the Duke of Ashcombe. The papers are signed. The date is set. There is nothing left to discuss." Adeline rose so quickly the cup rattled against its saucer. "Married? To a man I have never met? Father, this cannot be true." Her father would not look at her. He stared instead at the fireplace, at the flames eating away the last of the coal, as if the fire held more comfort than his daughter's face. "The Ashcombe estate has offered to settle our debts in full. In exchange, you will become his wife. It is done, Adeline. I am sorry." She felt the floor tilt beneath her. Everyone in the county knew the name Nathaniel Vane, Duke of Ashcombe. They knew it the way one knows the name of a disease, spoken in hushed voices, followed by a shudder. His first wife had died within a year of their marriage, found at the bottom of the east staircase, and no one, not the physician, not the magistrate, not even his own household staff, had ever given a full account of what happened that night. Since then, the Duke had lived like a shadow, rarely leaving his estate, refusing every invitation, dismissing servants who asked too many questions. "They call him Ruthless," Adeline whispered. "They say he does not feel sorrow, only calculation. Father, please, find another way." "There is no other way." His voice cracked, just slightly, the only sign that this decision cost him something too. "We lose the house, the land, everything, unless this marriage happens. I have already sent word. The carriage comes for you in 3 days." Adeline did not sleep that night. She sat by her window, watching the moon slide behind gray clouds, and tried to imagine the face of the man she would soon call husband. She pictured cruelty in his eyes, cold intention in his hands. She pictured a house full of secrets, and a staircase that had swallowed a woman whole. By morning, her Aunt Margaret arrived, uninvited and breathless, having heard the news from a neighbor's gossip before Adeline's own father could tell her himself. Margaret gripped Adeline's hand so tightly it almost hurt. "Listen to me," Margaret said, her eyes darting toward the door, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "I know women who worked in that house. They do not stay long. One told me the Duke walks the halls at night, alone, speaking to no one. Another said he keeps the west wing locked, and no servant is permitted inside, not even to clean. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "I understand that you are frightened for me," Adeline said quietly. "But I have no choice, Aunt Margaret. This marriage saves my family." "A family saved is no comfort if the daughter is lost," Margaret said, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. That afternoon, Adeline's closest friend, Charlotte, came to sit with her in the garden, where the roses had begun to wilt with the turning season. Charlotte was the only person who did not immediately warn her, did not immediately weep or clutch her sleeve. Instead, she asked a single question. "Has anyone ever actually proven he did something wrong?" Adeline blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Charlotte said, plucking a browning petal from the nearest bush, "everyone repeats the same story about his wife falling down the stairs. But has anyone ever said they saw what happened? Or are they simply repeating what they were told to believe?" It was a strange question, one Adeline had never considered. She had accepted the rumors the way she accepted the changing of the seasons, without questioning their source. "I do not know," she admitted. "I only know what everyone says." "Then perhaps," Charlotte said gently, "you should go and see for yourself what is true, rather than carry fear that may not belong to you." The words stayed with Adeline through the following days, even as the servants packed her belongings into trunks, even as her mother wept quietly in the hallway, even as the family carriage was prepared for the long journey north. She did not feel brave. She felt like a woman walking toward a door she could not see behind. But somewhere beneath the fear, a small, stubborn curiosity had begun to stir, refusing to let her simply believe what she had been told without seeing it herself. On the morning she left, the sky was the color of iron, heavy with a storm that refused to break. Her father embraced her at the carriage door, his eyes red though he tried to hide it. "You are stronger than you know," he said. "I would not send you into danger if I believed for a moment that you were." Adeline wanted to believe him. She wanted, more than anything, for that to be true. The journey to Ashcombe took the better part of 2 days, the carriage rattling over roads that grew narrower and lonelier the further north they traveled. Fields gave way to forests, and forests gave way to hills wrapped in mist, until finally, as the sun began to sink low and orange behind the trees, the estate came into view. It was not what Adeline had expected. She had pictured something grim, something built of dark stone and closed shutters, a house that matched the rumors that surrounded its master. Instead, Ashcombe rose from the hillside with a quiet, aching beauty, its windows catching the last light of day, its gardens still tended with obvious care despite the season. It did not look like the home of a monster. It looked like a house waiting for someone to bring it back to life. A servant met her at the door, a woman with kind eyes and a guarded expression, who introduced herself simply as Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper. She led Adeline through halls lined with portraits of vain ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. "The Duke will receive you in the drawing room," Mrs. Whitfield said. "He does not often receive guests, my lady. I hope you will forgive him if his manner seems reserved." "Reserved," Adeline repeated softly. It was a gentler word than the ones she had heard whispered in her own drawing room. She was led to a set of tall doors, polished dark wood with brass handles, that gleamed faintly in the candlelight. Mrs. Whitfield knocked once, then opened the doors and stepped aside. Adeline entered the room, and for the first time, she saw him. He stood by the window, tall and still, his dark coat fitted to broad shoulders, his hands clasped behind his back, as though he had been standing there for hours, waiting. When he turned to face her, she expected coldness. She expected the calculating stare that the rumors had promised her. Instead, she found a man whose eyes seemed tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour, and something else beneath that tiredness, something that looked almost like caution. "Lady Adeline Hartley," he said, his voice low and even, "I am glad you arrived safely." She curtsied, though her legs felt unsteady. "Your Grace." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He studied her the way one studies a puzzle whose pieces do not yet make sense, and she found herself doing the same, searching his face for the cruelty she had been promised, finding instead only careful, guarded silence. "You have heard things about me," he said finally. It was not a question. Adeline chose honesty. "I have heard many things, Your Grace." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "Most of them are true, in the sense that people believe them," he said. "Whether they are true in any other sense is a different matter entirely." He gestured toward a chair near the fire. "Please, sit. You have traveled a long way, and there will be time enough for questions." Adeline sat, though her eyes never left him, and as the fire crackled and the storm outside finally broke against the windows, she found herself wondering, for the first time since her father had spoken those terrible words in the drawing room days ago, whether everything she had been told to fear might not be the whole truth after all. Dinner that evening was a quiet affair, the two of them seated at opposite ends of a table long enough to seat 20, candlelight flickering between them like a fragile bridge. The Duke spoke little, but what he said was measured, careful, never cruel. He asked about her journey, about her family, about the roses in her mother's garden. Small questions that felt strangely tender coming from a man the world had painted as heartless. It was only when the meal ended and the servants withdrew that Adeline gathered the courage to ask the question that had followed her the entire journey north. "Your Grace, if I may ask, what happened to your first wife?" The candlelight seemed to dim, though nothing in the room had changed. The Duke set down his glass slowly, his jaw tightening, his eyes drifting toward the dark window, as though the answer lived somewhere out in the night, rather than within himself. "That," he said quietly, "is a story for another time. Tonight, I only ask that you trust me enough to wait." It was not the answer she wanted, but something in his voice, some quiet plea beneath the composure, made her nod instead of pressing further. As she was led to her chambers that night, past the locked doors of the West Wing, past portraits whose painted eyes still seemed to watch her, Adeline could not shake the feeling that the true story of Ashcombe had not yet begun, and that whatever waited in the shadows of this house was far more complicated than any rumor whispered in a drawing room far away. The following morning brought pale sunlight through Adeline's window, and with it, the strange, unfamiliar quiet of a house she did not yet understand. She dressed slowly, listening to the muffled sounds of servants moving through distant halls, the occasional creak of old wood settling, the far-off call of birds in the garden below. Nothing about the morning felt sinister, and yet she could not forget the way the Duke's face had changed the night before, how a single question had turned a composed man into someone guarded and distant. She found Mrs. Whitfield in the corridor outside her room, arranging fresh linens with quick, practiced hands. "Good morning, my lady," the housekeeper said, though her eyes did not quite meet Adeline's. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough," Adeline said. "Mrs. Whitfield, may I ask you something?" The housekeeper's hands stilled for the briefest moment. "Of course, my lady." "The West Wing," Adeline said carefully. "Why is it kept locked?" Mrs. Whitfield's expression closed like a door shutting. "That is not my place to say, my lady. If you wish to know, you must ask His Grace." She gathered the linens quickly and excused herself, leaving Adeline alone in the corridor with only her own uncertain thoughts for company. Over the following days, Adeline began to notice small things, the kind of details easily missed by someone determined only to be afraid. She noticed that the Duke rose early and often took long walks alone along the eastern edge of the property, near a staircase that led down toward the old stone terrace, the same staircase, she realized with a chill, where his first wife had been found. She noticed that he never spoke of his family, though portraits of ancestors lined nearly every hall. She noticed that the servants, though clearly loyal to him, exchanged careful glances whenever his name was mentioned, as though they, too, were guarding something they did not fully understand. One afternoon, while wandering the gardens alone, Adeline came upon the Duke seated on a stone bench near the edge of the property, staring out at the hills beyond. He did not hear her approach at first, and for a moment she watched him unnoticed, struck by how different he looked when he believed himself alone. The careful composure was gone. In its place was something rawer, heavier, a weight he seemed to carry every hour of every day. "Your Grace," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and the composure returned almost instantly, though not quickly enough to hide what she had seen. "Lady Adeline, forgive me, I did not hear you. I did not mean to intrude," she said, though she made no move to leave. "You seemed far away." "I often am," he admitted, surprising her with his honesty. "This house holds more memory than most people realize. Sometimes it is difficult to remain only in the present." Adeline sat carefully on the far end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Everyone in the county has a story about what happened here, about your first marriage." "I know," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I have heard every version. In some, I am a monster. In others, merely careless. None of them, as far as I know, is the truth." "Then tell me the truth," Adeline said, surprising herself with her own boldness. For a long moment, he said nothing. The wind moved through the garden, carrying the scent of late autumn roses, and somewhere in the distance, a bell rang faintly, marking the hour. "Not yet," he said finally. "Not because I wish to deceive you, but because some truths, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. I would rather you know me a little longer before I ask you to carry the weight of what happened here." It was not the answer Adeline wanted, but she found, strangely, that she believed him. There was no coldness in his voice, no calculation, only the careful restraint of a man protecting something, or someone, rather than hiding a crime. As the days passed and the wedding drew nearer, Adeline began to understand that the Duke she was preparing to marry was not the man the rumors had described. He was quieter than cruel, more haunted than heartless, a man carrying a grief so heavy it had reshaped the way the entire world saw him. And though the mystery of his first wife's death still hung over the house like a shadow that refused to lift, Adeline found herself no longer walking toward Ashcombe with fear alone. She walked toward it with questions, and for the first time since her father had spoken those terrible words in the drawing room days ago, she found herself determined to find the answers herself, rather than accept the story the world had already decided to believe. On the night before the wedding, unable to sleep, Adeline rose from her bed and walked quietly to her window, looking out over the moonlit gardens below. In the distance, she saw a single figure standing near the edge of the eastern staircase, still and silent, staring down into the darkness, as though searching for something that could never be found. She recognized him immediately, and though every warning she had ever received urged her to look away, to retreat back into the safety of her room, she found herself instead reaching for her shawl, drawn toward the mystery of the man she would marry in the morning, and toward the truth that waited, patiently, somewhere in the shadows of Ashcombe. The morning of the wedding arrived, with a sky washed pale gold, the kind of light that made even old stone walls look soft and forgiving. Adeline stood before the mirror in her chamber, as two maids fastened the buttons of her gown, their fingers quick and careful, their eyes occasionally flicking toward her with a mixture of pity and curiosity that she had grown used to over the past week. "You look beautiful, my lady," one of the maids whispered. Adeline studied her own reflection, and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Pale ivory silk, her hair pinned with small white flowers, her face composed in a way that hid the storm of thoughts underneath. She did not feel like a woman about to marry a monster. She felt like a woman about to marry a mystery, and the difference, she realized, mattered more than she had expected. Word of the wedding had spread quickly through the county, and guests began arriving by mid-morning, filling the chapel with quiet murmurs and curious glances. Adeline could hear them from her window, the soft rustle of arriving carriages, the low hum of conversation carried on the breeze. She wondered how many of them had come out of genuine goodwill, and how many had come simply to witness the fate of the woman foolish enough to marry the Duke of Ashcombe. Margaret arrived at her door just before the ceremony, her face pale with worry, despite the polite smile she forced for Adeline's sake. "You do not have to go through with this," she whispered, gripping Adeline's hands one final time. "It is not too late." "It is, Aunt Margaret," Adeline said gently, "but I do not think that is a bad thing." Margaret searched her face for a long moment, clearly startled by the calm she found there. "You are not afraid?" "I am afraid," Adeline admitted, "but not in the way you think." The walk to the chapel felt both impossibly long and impossibly short, the gravel path crunching beneath her slippers, the guests turning to watch as she passed, their whispered comments trailing behind her like a cold wind. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to let their judgment shape the moment that belonged only to her. The Duke waited at the altar, dressed in dark formal attire that made him look even taller, even more composed than usual. But as Adeline drew closer, she saw again what she had seen in the garden days before, the tiredness beneath his careful expression, the weight he carried, even in a moment that was supposed to be joyful. When she reached him, he offered his hand, and she took it without hesitation. "You look as though you are bracing for a battle," she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Perhaps I am simply bracing for happiness. It has been a long time since I allowed myself to expect it." The ceremony passed in a blur of vows and candlelight, the priest's voice steady and solemn, the guests watching with held breath as though expecting something to go wrong at any moment. But nothing did. When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, a quiet murmur of surprise moved through the chapel, as though the assembled guests could not quite believe the ceremony had concluded without incident. The wedding breakfast that followed was a stiff, formal affair, filled with polite conversation and careful smiles, though Adeline noticed how few of the guests approached the Duke directly, how many watched him from a distance, as though still waiting for the mask to slip. He endured it all with quiet patience, occasionally catching Adeline's eye across the room, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that neither needed words to explain. By the time evening arrived and the guests began to depart, Adeline felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the long day, and everything to do with the weight of being watched, judged, and whispered about since the moment she had arrived at Ashcombe. She retreated to her new chambers, connected by a private door to the Duke's own rooms, and sat by the window, watching the last of the carriages disappear down the long drive toward the main road. A soft knock came at the door between their rooms. "May I enter?" the Duke's voice asked, quiet and careful, as though he expected her to refuse. "Yes," Adeline said, rising to face him as the door opened. He stepped into the room slowly, his earlier composure now softened into something more uncertain, more human. He studied her for a long moment, the candlelight flickering between them, before finally speaking. "I know this day has been difficult for you," he said. "The whispers, the stares. I am sorry you had to endure them because of who I am." "You did not choose the rumors that follow you," Adeline said. "I do not blame you for them." "Many would," he said quietly. "Most do." He moved closer, stopping just an arm's length away, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was no coldness in his gaze, no calculation, only something raw and unguarded, something that looked almost like fear. "Adeline," he said softly, using her name without title for the first time. "Are you afraid?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than she expected, carrying with it every rumor she had ever heard, every warning whispered by frightened servants and worried friends. But as she looked into his eyes, searching for the monster the world had promised her, she found only a man, asking a question he seemed almost afraid to hear answered. "No," she said finally, surprising herself with how certain she sounded. "I am not afraid of you." Something shifted in his expression, relief and disbelief mingling together in a way that made him look, for the first time since she had met him, entirely unguarded. "Everyone else was," he said quietly. "Everyone else believed the stories before they ever met me." "I did too, at first," Adeline admitted. "But stories are not always truth, Your Grace." "Nathaniel," he said softly, "please, if we are to build something honest between us, let it begin with my name." "Nathaniel," she repeated, and the word felt strange and new in her mouth, a small act of trust neither of them had expected to offer so soon. He reached out, hesitating for only a moment before gently taking her hand in his fingers warm and careful, as though he feared she might still pull away. "There is much I have not told you," he said, "about my first wife, about this house, about the things that happen in the shadows here, things I do not yet fully understand myself. I will tell you everything, Adeline, when the time is right. But tonight, I only wanted to know one thing."
"And now you know it," she said softly.
He nodded, and for a long moment, they simply stood together in the quiet candlelight, two strangers bound by circumstance who had, against every expectation, found something unexpected in each other. Outside, the wind moved gently through the gardens, carrying with it the scent of roses and the distant memory of a woman who had once walked these same halls and never left them alive. But inside the room, for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe, Adeline felt something other than fear settle over her, a fragile, uncertain hope that whatever waited in the shadows of this house, she would not have to face it alone. A scream tore through the silence of the house just before dawn, and Adeline sat upright in bed, her heart pounding before she even understood why. She rushed to the connecting door, and found Nathaniel already awake, standing in the dark, his hand pressed against the wall, as though bracing himself against something only he could see. "Nathaniel," she said, hurrying toward him. "What is it? Who screamed?" "No one," he said, his voice rough. "It was a dream, my own voice, I think, though I cannot remember what frightened me." She studied him carefully, in the pale light creeping through the curtains, noting the sweat on his brow, the tension in his shoulders, the haunted look that had returned to his eyes, despite the tenderness of the night before. "This happens often," she said. It was not a question. He did not deny it. "Since Beatrice died," he said quietly, "I have not slept a full night without waking like this." Adeline led him gently to the chair by the window, and after a long silence, he finally began to speak, his voice low and careful, as though the words themselves were dangerous. "Beatrice was clever," he said, "cleverer than anyone gave her credit for. In the months before she died, she came to me convinced that someone within this household was stealing from the estate, slowly, carefully, in ways that would not be noticed for years. She kept records, notes. She hid them somewhere in the West Wing, though she never told me exactly where." "You believe someone killed her because of what she discovered," Adeline said softly. "I have believed it for 3 years," Nathaniel said. "But belief is not proof, and every time I tried to investigate, doors closed. Servants who might have known something left suddenly, given generous severance and vague explanations. The magistrate ruled her death an accident within a week, though I never understood how such a ruling could be reached so quickly." "Who would benefit from her silence?" Adeline asked. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "My cousin, Gerald. He manages a portion of the estate's finances, a responsibility I inherited from my father and never had reason to question, until Beatrice raised her concerns. If the stealing she suspected was real, Gerald had the most to lose from its discovery, and the most to gain from her silence." "Have you confronted him?" "Once," Nathaniel admitted. "He denied everything, of course, and reminded me that grief had clouded my judgment. I had no proof, Only suspicion. And suspicion alone is not enough to accuse a man of murder, especially a man who has spent years cultivating the sympathy of everyone who matters in this county. Adeline felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. Why are you telling me this now? Nathaniel turned to look at her fully, his eyes searching hers with the same raw honesty she had seen the night before. Because you asked for the truth, and because I believe, whether it is wise or not, that you deserve to know what kind of house you have married into. I will understand if this frightens you more than any rumor ever did. It does not frighten me, Adeline said, surprising herself again with her own steadiness. It makes me want to help you find the truth. Something shifted in his expression, gratitude mixed with disbelief, as though he had not expected such an offer, and did not quite know how to accept it. Adeline, this is dangerous. If Gerald did what I suspect, he would not hesitate to protect himself again. Then we will be careful, she said simply. But I will not spend my marriage pretending I do not see the shadows in this house. I would rather face them beside you than live in fear of them alone. Over the following days, Adeline began to move through Ashcombe with new purpose, observing details she had previously dismissed as simply strange. She noticed that Gerald visited the estate more frequently than a distant cousin managing finances should require, always arriving with polished charm and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. She noticed that he watched her carefully whenever they crossed paths, his questions about her adjustment to married life, carrying an edge of curiosity that felt less like kindness and more like assessment. She noticed, too, that Mrs. Whitfield grew visibly uneasy whenever Gerald's name was mentioned, her hands stilling over whatever task occupied them, her eyes darting toward the nearest door as though checking for listeners. One afternoon, while Nathaniel attended to estate business in the study, Adeline found Mrs. Whitfield alone in the linen room and gently closed the door behind her. Mrs. Whitfield, she said carefully, I know you have served this family for many years. I believe you know more about what happened to the first Duchess than you have ever said aloud. The housekeeper's hands trembled slightly as she folded a sheet, her eyes fixed on the fabric rather than on Adeline. It is not my place, my lady. Please, Adeline said softly. I am not asking to cause trouble. I am asking because I believe someone in this house may still be in danger, and I would rather prevent another tragedy than remain silent out of fear. For a long moment, Mrs. Whitfield said nothing, her jaw tight, her hands still. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. The night the Duchess died, I heard voices near the east staircase, hers and a man's. I did not see who it was, my lady. I swear it. But I heard the man tell her that some things were better left buried, and I heard her refuse to be silenced. Moments later, I heard her fall. Adeline's breath caught. Why did you never tell anyone? Because the man who visited me the following morning made it very clear what would happen to my family if I spoke, Mrs. Whitfield said, tears welling in her eyes. I have carried this silence for 3 years, my lady. I do not know how much longer I can bear its weight. You do not have to bear it alone any longer, Adeline said gently, reaching for the older woman's trembling hands. Will you help us find the truth, if we can promise your safety? Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, fear and relief warring plainly across her face, before finally nodding. I will tell His Grace everything I remember, she whispered. It is time this house stopped hiding in the dark. That evening, when Adeline shared what she had learned with Nathaniel, she watched years of carefully controlled grief finally crack across his composed features, replaced by something sharper, more determined. For the first time since her arrival at Ashcombe, she saw not a haunted man resigned to living beneath the weight of unanswered questions, but a man finally ready to fight for the truth his first wife had died trying to expose. We will find Beatrice's notes, he said quietly, his voice steady with new resolve. And we will find the proof that has eluded me for 3 years. Whatever waits in the West Wing, Adeline, we will face it together. She took his hand, feeling the tremor of restrained anger beneath his calm exterior, and nodded. Together, she agreed. And for the first time, the word felt like a promise, rather than simply a vow spoken before a priest. A key would not turn in the lock, no matter how carefully Adeline twisted it, and the sound of footsteps, somewhere down the corridor, sent a jolt of panic through her chest. She pressed herself against the wall beside the West Wing door, holding her breath, listening as the footsteps grew louder, then faded away toward the kitchens. Only then did she release the breath she had been holding, and return her attention to the stubborn lock. Nathaniel had given her the key that morning, retrieved from a drawer in his study where it had sat untouched since Beatrice's death, but the lock itself had rusted with disuse, and it took several long, tense minutes before it finally gave way with a reluctant click. The West Wing greeted her with the particular silence of a place long abandoned, dust hanging in the pale light that filtered through curtained windows, furniture draped in white cloth like sleeping ghosts. Adeline moved carefully through the rooms, her candle casting long shadows across walls lined with portraits of vain ancestors, until she reached what had clearly once been Beatrice's private sitting room. It was smaller than she expected, intimate in a way that made Adeline feel like an intruder into a life cut tragically short. A writing desk sat near the window, its surface bare except for a thin layer of dust, and a shelf of books lined one wall, their spines faded with time. Adeline began searching methodically, her hands trembling slightly as she opened drawers, checked beneath furniture, ran her fingers along the underside of shelves searching for anything hidden. It was Nathaniel, arriving quietly behind her after finishing his estate business, who noticed what she had missed. He knelt beside the writing desk and pressed gently against a small panel near its base, one that appeared, at first glance, to be simply decorative. The panel gave way with a soft click, revealing a hidden compartment no larger than a book. Inside, they found a leather journal, its pages filled with Beatrice's careful, precise handwriting, detailing months of quiet observation. Numbers that did not match the estate's official records, dates of unusual withdrawals, names of tenants who had supposedly paid rents that never appeared in the ledgers Gerald maintained, and near the final entries, a note that made Adeline's blood run cold. Gerald grows suspicious of my questions. He has begun watching me more closely than before. If something happens to me, I want it known that I do not trust him, and I do not believe the discrepancies in the estate's finances are the result of simple error. She knew, Nathaniel said quietly, his voice thick with old grief and new fury. She knew he was watching her, and still she continued investigating. She was braver than I ever gave her credit for. We have proof now, Adeline said, carefully closing the journal. Proof of the missing funds, at least. It may be enough to bring the magistrate back to reconsider her death. It may also be enough to make Gerald desperate, Nathaniel said grimly. A desperate man is far more dangerous than a careful one, Adeline. We must be cautious about how we use this. They agreed to keep the discovery secret for the time being, hidden away in Nathaniel's private study, rather than shared openly, while quietly gathering additional evidence to strengthen their case, before confronting Gerald directly. Mrs. Whitfield, freed from years of enforced silence, began recalling additional details, small observations that, pieced together with Beatrice's journal, painted an increasingly damning picture of systematic theft carried out over several years, concealed through careful manipulation of the estate's records. But secrets, Adeline soon learned, were difficult to keep entirely hidden in a house where servants moved through every corridor and Gerald himself visited with unsettling frequency. 3 days after discovering the journal, she noticed a subtle change in his demeanor during his latest visit, a sharpness beneath his usual polished charm, his eyes lingering a moment too long on her whenever their paths crossed in the halls. You seem different lately, cousin's wife, he remarked one afternoon, finding her alone in the library, his tone light but his gaze calculating. More curious about the house, I hear. Mrs. Whitfield mentioned you have taken an interest in the West Wing. Adeline kept her expression carefully neutral, though her heart raced beneath her composed exterior. It seemed a shame to leave such a beautiful part of the house locked and forgotten. Some things are locked away for good reason, Gerald said, his voice smooth, but carrying an unmistakable edge. I would advise caution, my lady. Old houses hold old secrets, and not every secret is meant to be uncovered. He left without waiting for a response, but his warning lingered in the air, long after he had gone, confirming what Adeline had already begun to suspect. Gerald knew, or at least suspected, that they were investigating him, and a man with everything to lose would not simply wait patiently to see what they discovered next. That evening, she relayed the exchange to Nathaniel, watching his expression harden with each word. We must move more quickly than we planned, he said, pacing the length of his study, his earlier caution giving way to urgency. If Gerald believes we are close to exposing him, he may act to protect himself before we have gathered enough evidence to stop him. What do you propose? Adeline asked. I will write to the magistrate directly, requesting he review Beatrice's case with the new evidence we have gathered, Nathaniel said. It is a risk, showing our hand before we are entirely ready, but waiting carries risks of its own, ones I am no longer willing to accept. Adeline nodded, though a cold unease settled in her chest, a growing certainty that the careful, patient investigation they had begun was about to give way to something far more dangerous, a confrontation neither of them could fully predict or control. Outside the study window, the last light of day faded into darkness, and somewhere beyond the walls of Ashcombe, a man with everything to lose was, she suspected, already planning his next move. Glass shattered somewhere below, and Adeline shot upright in bed, her pulse hammering, as she strained to listen through the darkness. A second sound followed, softer, deliberate, footsteps moving carefully across the ground floor, far too late for any servant to be about their usual duties. She reached for her shawl and hurried to the connecting door, finding Nathaniel already awake and pulling on his coat. Stay here, he whispered, though the tension in his voice told her he did not truly expect her to obey. I will not, Adeline said firmly, following him toward the door. Whatever this is, we face it together, remember? They moved quietly through the darkened halls, guided only by the faint moonlight through tall windows, until they reached the study where Nathaniel had kept the letter to the magistrate, along with copies of the evidence they had gathered. The door stood ajar, and inside, a figure hunched over the desk, papers scattered across the floor in his haste. Gerald, Nathaniel said, his voice cutting sharply through the silence. The man startled, spinning to face them, and in the pale moonlight, Adeline saw an expression far more desperate than the polished charm he usually wore like armor. Nathaniel, Gerald said, forcing calm into his voice despite the papers clutched in his trembling hands. I can explain. Explain what, exactly? Nathaniel asked, stepping fully into the room, his own composure hardening into something cold and unyielding. Explain why you are searching my study in the middle of the night, or explain why my late wife's private journal named you as the man she feared most in the months before her death. Gerald's mask slipped further, revealing the panic beneath. You do not understand the position I have been in, he said, his voice rising. The estate's finances have never been as sound as everyone believes. I made mistakes, years ago, small ones at first, and by the time I realized how deep the hole had grown, there was no way to fix it without exposing myself to ruin. So you stole from your own family, Nathaniel said, his voice deadly quiet. And when Beatrice discovered your theft, you silenced her. It was not meant to happen the way it did, Gerald said, and for the first time, something like genuine regret flickered across his face, quickly buried beneath renewed desperation. I only meant to frighten her into silence. She would not listen. She threatened to expose everything, to ruin me entirely, and in the argument that followed, she fell. I swear to you, Nathaniel, I did not intend for her to die. Adeline felt the room grow impossibly still, the confession hanging heavy in the air between them. Nathaniel's hands clenched at his sides, years of suppressed grief and suspicion finally finding their target, his entire body trembling with barely restrained fury. You let me carry this grief alone for 3 years, Nathaniel said, his voice breaking slightly despite his obvious effort to remain composed. You let the entire county believe I was capable of harming my own wife, while you continued stealing from this family and living beneath my roof, as though nothing had happened. What choice did I have? Gerald said, panic overtaking whatever regret he had briefly shown. If the truth came out, I would lose everything. My position, my reputation, my freedom. I could not allow that, Nathaniel, not then, and not now. Something in his tone shifted, and Adeline felt a fresh wave of alarm as she noticed his hand moving toward the letter opener resting on the desk beside him. Nathaniel, she said sharply, be careful. Gerald's eyes darted toward her, calculating, and for a terrible moment, Adeline feared he might see her as a more vulnerable target than his cousin. You should not have involved yourself in this, my lady, he said quietly. This was never meant to concern you. It concerns me the moment I became part of this family, Adeline said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. You cannot silence us both without confirming everything Beatrice's journal already suggests. Gerald's grip tightened around the letter opener, his eyes flicking between them. weighing options that had narrowed considerably in the past few minutes.
I only need time.
He muttered, more to himself than to either of them. Time to leave, to disappear somewhere no one will find me. You will not leave this room, Nathaniel said, stepping forward with slow, deliberate purpose, positioning himself carefully between Gerald and Adeline. Not until the magistrate arrives to hear the truth you have just confessed. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The only sound the ragged breathing of three people caught in a confrontation none of them had fully anticipated. Then, with a sudden burst of desperate energy, Gerald lunged toward the study's side door, papers scattering behind him as he fled into the darkened corridor beyond. "Stay here," Nathaniel commanded, already moving to follow, but Adeline caught his arm. "Not alone," she said firmly. "We agreed, Nathaniel. Together." He hesitated only a moment before nodding, and together they pursued Gerald through the darkened halls of Ashcombe, the desperate man's footsteps echoing ahead of them as he fled deeper into the house, toward the one place that had haunted this family for 3 long years, the east staircase, where Beatrice had drawn her final breath, and where, Adeline feared, this desperate chase might be heading toward another tragedy entirely. Gerald reached the top of the east staircase and stopped abruptly, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the sudden, terrible realization of where his flight had led him. Below, the staircase descended into darkness, the same steps that had claimed Beatrice's life 3 years before, and for a long, suspended moment, he stood frozen at the edge, staring down as though seeing a memory, rather than simply an empty passage. "Gerald," Nathaniel said carefully, slowing his approach, his hands raised slightly, as though calming a frightened animal. "Step back from the edge." "I never meant for any of this to happen," Gerald said, his voice cracking, all pretense of composure finally abandoned. "Not Beatrice's death, not the years of lies that followed. I told myself I would find a way to make it right, and instead, I only buried myself deeper." "Then let this be the moment you begin to make it right," Adeline said gently, stepping carefully beside Nathaniel, keeping her voice calm despite the danger of the situation. "Facing the truth now, however difficult, is still better than the alternative you seem to be considering." Gerald's eyes moved between them, torn between fear and something that looked almost like relief, at finally being seen clearly, after years of careful deception. "The magistrate will not believe a confession made in fear," he said. "He will only see a desperate man, trying to escape justice." "He will believe Beatrice's journal," Nathaniel said steadily. "He will believe Mrs. Whitfield's testimony, and he will believe whatever you choose to tell him honestly, here and now, rather than the version you might construct later, once fear has had time to reshape your memory into something more convenient." For a long moment, Gerald said nothing, his gaze drifting once more toward the staircase below, toward the place where his desperate choices had cost a woman her life. Then, slowly, visibly, the tension in his shoulders began to ease, replaced by something heavier, more resigned. "I am tired," he said quietly. "Tired of carrying this alone. Tired of watching you grieve a wife I helped take from you, while pretending I felt nothing but sympathy for your loss." He stepped back from the edge of the staircase, his hands trembling as he set down the letter opener he had carried through their entire desperate chase, letting it clatter softly against the floor. The fight seemed to drain out of him entirely, replaced by a quiet, exhausted surrender that felt, to Adeline, far more genuine than anything he had shown them before. Servants, roused by the commotion, began appearing at the edges of the corridor, drawn by the sound of raised voices and hurried footsteps. Mrs. Whitfield arrived first, her eyes widening as she took in the scene before her, understanding immediately what had transpired. "Send for the magistrate," Nathaniel instructed, his voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in his features. "Tonight, if possible. This matter has waited 3 years for justice. It will not wait any longer." As servants hurried to carry out his instructions, Nathaniel guided Gerald firmly, but without unnecessary force, toward a chair in the nearby study, watching him carefully to ensure no further attempt at escape, while Adeline remained close beside them both, her earlier fear giving way to a strange, quiet steadiness, now that the confrontation had finally reached its resolution. The magistrate arrived within the hour, summoned from his nearby residence by an urgent messenger, his expression grim as he listened to Nathaniel's account of the evening's events, supplemented by Beatrice's journal and Mrs. Whitfield's long-suppressed testimony. Gerald, seated quietly in the corner of the study, offered no denial when questioned directly, his earlier desperation replaced by a kind of hollow resignation. "I will need statements from everyone involved," the magistrate said finally, closing his notebook with a heavy sigh. "And a formal review of the estate's financial records to determine the full extent of what has been taken. This will take time, Your Grace, but I believe, given what you have shown me tonight, that justice for your late wife is finally within reach." As Gerald was led away into the custody of the magistrate's men, Nathaniel remained standing in the study doorway, watching until the last sound of departing footsteps faded into silence. Adeline moved quietly to stand beside him, resting a gentle hand on his arm. "It is over," she said softly. "Not entirely," Nathaniel replied, though something in his voice had shifted. A heaviness lifted even as new burdens settled in its place. "There will be a trial. Questions from the county that will not be easily silenced. But for the first time in 3 years, Adeline, I feel as though I am finally standing on solid ground rather than sinking beneath suspicion I could never quite disprove." She studied his face in the pale light of early dawn, beginning to creep through the study windows, seeing exhaustion there, but also something new, something that looked, cautiously, like the first fragile shape of peace. "Beatrice would be glad," she said quietly, "to know the truth finally found its way into the light." Nathaniel nodded slowly, his eyes distant with old grief, but his hand found Adeline's and held it firmly, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had faced together in the short weeks since her arrival at Ashcombe. "She would be glad," he agreed, "and I believe she would be glad too, that I did not have to face this final truth entirely alone." Outside, the sun rose fully over the hills surrounding Ashcombe, casting warm golden light across gardens that had witnessed both tragedy and, now, the fragile beginning of something new. While inside the ancient walls of the house, two people who had entered their marriage as strangers, bound by circumstance, stood together in the aftermath of danger, no longer strangers at all. A letter arrived 3 days later, bearing news that shattered the fragile calm settling over Ashcombe. Adeline read it twice before fully understanding its contents, her hands tightening around the paper as she hurried to find Nathaniel in his study. "The magistrate's clerk has gone missing," she said, breathless from hurrying through the halls, along with several pages from the estate's financial ledgers that were meant to serve as evidence. Nathaniel rose sharply from his desk, his earlier relief giving way to renewed alarm. "That is not possible. Those records were secured the night Gerald was taken into custody. According to this letter, someone accessed them 2 nights ago," Adeline said. "The magistrate suspects the clerk acted alone, but he wanted us informed immediately, given how it may affect the case against your cousin." Nathaniel's jaw tightened as understanding settled over his features. Gerald did not act alone in stealing from this estate. He could not have concealed such extensive theft for years without help from someone with access to official records. If the clerk has fled with evidence, it suggests he was protecting more than simply his own reputation. "Do you believe he was working with Gerald from the beginning?" Adeline asked. "I believe it is entirely possible," Nathaniel said grimly. "And if that is true, then whoever helped Gerald conceal his theft for 3 years may still be working to protect themselves, even with Gerald already in custody." They traveled to the county courthouse the following morning, where the magistrate greeted them with visible frustration, his earlier confidence in the case shaken by the missing clerk and the vanished ledger pages. "I have sent men to search for him," the magistrate explained, "but I fear he may have already left the county entirely. Without those records, proving the full extent of the theft becomes considerably more difficult. We still have Beatrice's journal," Nathaniel said, "and Mrs. Whitfield's testimony regarding the night of her death." "Which speaks to her death, certainly," the magistrate agreed, "but proving the financial theft that motivated it will be far harder without the original records. Your cousin's defense will likely argue that the journal reflects only suspicion, not proof, if we cannot produce corroborating evidence." Adeline felt a familiar knot of frustration tightening in her chest, the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had carried her through the West Wing search weeks before. "There may be another way," she said slowly, an idea forming even as she spoke it aloud. "Beatrice mentioned in her journal that she cross-referenced the estate's records against tenant payments. If we approach the tenants directly, asking them to confirm what they actually paid in past years, We might be able to reconstruct the discrepancies without relying on the missing ledgers at all. The magistrate considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. It would require considerable effort, and tenants may be reluctant to involve themselves in matters concerning the Duke's own family. But it is a reasonable approach, my lady, and possibly our best remaining option. Over the following 2 weeks, Adeline and Nathaniel visited tenant families across the estate together, a task that proved far more delicate than either had anticipated. Many families remained wary of involving themselves in what they viewed as private matters between the Duke and his cousin, fearful of consequences regardless of which side ultimately prevailed. But as word spread of Beatrice's death, and the suspicion now surrounding Gerald's management of the estate's finances, a slow shift began among the tenant community, sympathy growing for the young duchess who had died attempting to protect them from quiet exploitation. One elderly farmer, a man named Edmund who had worked the same land for nearly 40 years, proved particularly helpful, producing carefully kept personal records of his own rent payments that directly contradicted the figures Gerald had officially reported to the estate. I always wondered why my payments never seemed to reduce my debt the way they should have, Edmund admitted, showing them his worn ledger with visible relief at finally being asked. I assumed I simply misunderstood the arrangements. I did not think to question a man of Mr. Gerald's position. Similar stories emerged from other tenant families, each contributing another small piece to the growing picture of systematic theft that Gerald had concealed for years beneath careful manipulation of official records. By the time they returned to the magistrate with their findings, they carried testimony from nearly a dozen tenant families, more than enough to reconstruct the missing evidence and strengthen the case considerably. This is remarkable work, the magistrate said, reviewing the collected statements with evident satisfaction. I believe we now have sufficient evidence to proceed with the trial as originally planned, missing ledgers notwithstanding. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Nathaniel paused, turning to face Adeline with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that looked almost like wonder. You did this, he said quietly. When the evidence seemed lost, you found another path forward entirely on your own. We did this, Adeline corrected gently. Together, remember? He reached for her hand, holding it firmly as they walked together toward the waiting carriage, the county courthouse behind them, and the promise of justice, however delayed, finally within reach. But even as relief settled over them both, Adeline could not shake a lingering unease, a quiet certainty that the missing clerk, wherever he had fled, still represented a loose thread that might yet unravel the careful case they had worked so hard to build. A stranger stood at the edge of the Ashcombe Gardens at dusk, watching the house with an intensity that made the gardener's young assistant drop his shears and hurry inside to report what he had seen. By the time Nathaniel reached the window with a lantern, the figure had vanished into the tree line, leaving only footprints in the soft earth as evidence he had ever been there at all. It could be nothing, Adeline said, though her own uneasy tone betrayed how little she believed her own reassurance. A traveler, perhaps, lost on the road. Or the missing clerk, deciding whether to run further or attempt to silence the evidence we have gathered, Nathaniel said grimly, setting down the lantern with a heavy thud. I will not take chances with your safety, Adeline. I am doubling the household guard until the trial concludes. The days leading up to the trial passed with a tension that settled over Ashcombe like a held breath, every unfamiliar sound sending servants hurrying to check locked doors, every visitor arriving at the estate greeted with more caution than courtesy required. Adeline found herself unable to fully relax even within the walls of her own chambers, aware that whoever had helped Gerald conceal his theft for years remained free, and potentially desperate enough to act again. The trial itself, when it finally began, drew crowds from across the county, curious onlookers filling the small courthouse to witness the proceedings that had dominated local gossip for weeks. Adeline sat beside Nathaniel in the front row, her hand tightly clasped in his, watching as the magistrate presented the case with careful, methodical precision, building from Beatrice's journal through Mrs. Whitfield's testimony to the tenant statements they had gathered together. Gerald, seated across the courtroom beside his appointed counsel, appeared a shadow of the polished, charming man Adeline had first encountered months before, his composure entirely stripped away, replaced by hollow resignation. When called to testify, he offered little resistance to the evidence presented against him, his earlier desperate hope for escape having apparently faded entirely into acceptance of consequences long delayed. But it was during a recess on the second day of the trial that the tension Adeline had carried since the mysterious figure appeared in the gardens finally found its resolution. A commotion arose outside the courthouse, voices raised in surprise and alarm, drawing spectators and officials alike toward the entrance. The missing clerk, it emerged, had been apprehended, attempting to flee the county entirely, caught by county officials, alerted to his description through the ongoing investigation. Brought before the magistrate in a hastily arranged additional proceeding, he offered a confession far more detailed than Gerald's own, revealing the full extent of the conspiracy that had concealed years of theft from the estate. "Gerald approached me nearly 4 years ago," the clerk admitted, his voice shaking with obvious fear of the consequences now facing him. He offered payment in exchange for altering official records, small discrepancies at first, that grew larger over time. When the Duchess began asking questions, he grew desperate, and I helped him remove evidence from official channels rather than risk exposure of my own involvement. "Did you know of his intentions toward the Duchess?" the magistrate asked sharply. "Not until after," the clerk said, his composure finally breaking entirely. "He told me only that she had fallen, that it was an accident. I did not learn the truth of what happened that night until much later, and by then, I was already too deeply involved to extract myself without facing ruin alongside him." The additional confession, combined with the evidence already presented, effectively sealed the outcome of the trial that had gripped the county for weeks. As the proceedings drew toward their conclusion, the magistrate addressed the courtroom with the same grave formality that had characterized the entire trial. "The evidence presented leaves little room for doubt," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "Gerald Vane will face full consequences for both the financial theft perpetrated against this estate and for his role in the death of Beatrice, Duchess of Ashcombe, 3 years past. Justice long delayed has finally, today, been served." A murmur moved through the assembled crowd, relief and vindication mingling with the lingering shock of finally hearing confirmed what had, for years, remained only whispered rumor. Adeline felt Nathaniel's hand tighten around hers, and when she turned to look at him, she saw tears finally breaking through the composure he had maintained for so long. 3 years of suppressed grief and suspicion, finally given permission to surface. "It is finished," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "After 3 years, Adeline, it is finally finished." She squeezed his hand gently, understanding that while the trial itself had reached its conclusion, the deeper work of healing from years of grief and false suspicion had only just begun. "Not finished," she said softly. "Just beginning, perhaps, in a way that finally allows you to grieve Beatrice properly, without the shadow of unanswered questions hanging over every memory of her." Nathaniel nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with unsteady hands, before turning to look at her with an expression of such raw gratitude that it left her momentarily breathless. "I did not expect, when I agreed to this marriage, that I would find someone willing to fight so fiercely for truth I had almost given up hope of ever finding," he said quietly. "You have given me something I thought I had lost entirely, Adeline. Not just justice for Beatrice, but the possibility of believing, again, that this house might someday feel like a home, rather than simply a place haunted by unanswered grief." As they left the courthouse together, the crowds outside no longer whispering with suspicion, but rather offering quiet nods of sympathy and respect, Adeline felt the weight of months of uncertainty finally beginning to lift, replaced by something she had not expected to find when she first arrived at Ashcombe, as a frightened bride facing an uncertain future. A genuine, hard-won partnership, built not on rumor or fear, but on shared courage in the face of difficult truth. A carriage arrived unannounced at Ashcombe's front gate, and Adeline's stomach tightened with immediate apprehension as she recognized the crest painted on its side. Her father had come, without warning, weeks after the trial's conclusion, and she hurried to the entrance, uncertain whether to expect relief or renewed conflict from his unexpected visit. He stepped down from the carriage looking older than she remembered, though his eyes softened considerably the moment he saw her hurrying toward him across the gravel drive. "Adeline," he said, his voice catching slightly. "I heard news of the trial. I came as soon as I could arrange the journey." "Father," she said, embracing him warmly despite her surprise, "you did not need to travel so far. A letter would have sufficed." "A letter could not properly convey how proud I am of you," he said, pulling back to study her face carefully, as though searching for confirmation that the daughter he had sent north in fear was truly the composed, confident woman standing before him now. When I arranged this marriage, I feared I was sending you into danger for the sake of our family's survival. I did not imagine you would emerge not merely unharmed, but instrumental in uncovering truth that had eluded an entire county for years. Nathaniel joined them at the entrance, offering a formal bow toward his father-in-law, though the warmth in his expression suggested genuine welcome rather than mere courtesy. Your daughter's courage exceeded anything I could have hoped for when I agreed to this arrangement, he said. I owe her a debt I am not certain I can ever fully repay. Adeline's father studied the Duke carefully, the same assessment she remembered from months before, when rumors alone had shaped his understanding of the man his daughter was set to marry. Whatever he saw now seemed to satisfy whatever lingering doubts he had carried through the long journey north. The rumors that followed you for years did not prepare me for the man standing before me today, he admitted. I am glad, Your Grace, that my daughter saw past them when I myself could not. Over the following days, Adeline's father remained at Ashcombe, and she found herself sharing with him, piece by piece, the full account of everything that had transpired since her arrival. The initial fear and uncertainty, the gradual understanding that grew between herself and Nathaniel, the careful investigation into Beatrice's death, and finally the trial that had brought long overdue justice to a house shadowed by grief and false suspicion for far too long. I confess, her father said one evening as they walked together through the gardens, I worried I had condemned you to unhappiness for the sake of our family's finances, discovering instead that you found genuine partnership and perhaps something deeper still, brings me more relief than I can properly express. It was not an easy beginning, Adeline admitted. I arrived here frightened, believing every terrible thing whispered about this house and its master. But fear, I have learned, often obscures truth rather than revealing it. Had I allowed the rumors to shape my judgment entirely, I would never have discovered the man Nathaniel truly is, nor found the courage to help him seek justice for Beatrice. Her father nodded slowly, considering her words with evident thoughtfulness. Your mother always said you possessed a stubborn refusal to accept easy answers, he said, a fond smile touching his lips. I see now that stubbornness served you well, when so many others might have simply accepted the frightened rumors and never looked beyond them. As the days passed and her father prepared eventually to return home, satisfied by what he had witnessed of his daughter's new life, Adeline found herself reflecting on how dramatically her circumstances had shifted since that terrible morning when her father first delivered news of the arranged marriage. The frightened uncertainty that had once defined her understanding of Ashcombe had transformed, slowly but completely, into something resembling genuine belonging, a sense that this house, despite the tragedy embedded in its history, had become, gradually and unmistakably, her home. The county, too, had begun to shift its perception of the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe. Gossip that had once painted Nathaniel as a figure of suspicion and quiet menace, now replaced by admiration for the courage he and his young wife had shown in finally exposing the truth behind Beatrice's death. Invitations began arriving that had never come before. Neighbors who had once avoided the estate entirely, now expressing genuine interest in reconnecting with a family long isolated by rumor and fear. Nathaniel, for his part, seemed to unfold slowly in the aftermath of the trial. The careful guardedness that had defined his manner since Adeline's arrival, gradually giving way to something warmer, more open, as though justice finally served, had allowed him permission to breathe freely for the first time in years. He laughed more easily now, Adeline noticed, and spoke of the future with a hopefulness that had been entirely absent during their first uncertain weeks together. One evening, as they sat together in the garden where he had first shown her genuine vulnerability, months before, Nathaniel turned to her with an expression of quiet contemplation. I have been thinking, he said, about the night we first became truly husband and wife. Do you remember the question I asked you then? I remember, Adeline said softly, the memory still vivid despite everything that had transpired since. You asked if I was afraid. And you told me you were not, he said. Even then, before you knew the full truth of what happened here, before we had faced any of what followed together, you found the courage to answer honestly, rather than simply telling me what you believed I wanted to hear. I meant it, Adeline said. I was not afraid of you, Nathaniel. I was only afraid of the unknown, of rumors I had not yet learned to question. He reached for her hand, holding it gently in the fading evening light, his eyes carrying none of the careful guardedness that had once defined every interaction between them. I find myself wanting to ask you something else now, he said quietly. Though it is perhaps a strange question for a husband to ask his wife, after everything we have already faced together. Ask it, Adeline said, curiosity replacing whatever brief uncertainty his tone had stirred. Are you happy? He asked simply, the question carrying a vulnerability that mirrored the fear beneath his very first inquiry months before. Adeline considered the question seriously, thinking of everything that had brought her to this moment, the terrifying uncertainty of her arranged marriage, the careful unraveling of rumor and truth, the danger they had faced together in pursuit of justice long delayed, and finally, the quiet, unexpected peace that had settled over Ashcombe in the weeks since the trial's conclusion. Yes, she said finally, with the same certainty she had offered him months before. I am happy, Nathaniel. Happier, perhaps, than I ever imagined possible when I first arrived at this house as a frightened stranger. Something in his expression softened entirely at her answer, relief and quiet joy replacing the last traces of the careful guardedness that had once defined him so completely. Then perhaps, he said softly, we have both finally found what we were searching for, even if neither of us fully understood what that search truly involved when it began. Bells rang across the county on the morning of the Harvest Festival, and Adeline woke to find sunlight pouring warmly through curtains that had once seemed to filter only shadow and suspicion into her chambers. A full year had passed since her arrival at Ashcombe as a frightened bride, and the house that had once felt heavy with unspoken grief now hummed with the quiet, ordinary rhythms of a home, finally at peace with its own history. She dressed quickly, eager to join the festivities that had, for the first time in years, been organized to include tenants and neighbors from across the county, a celebration Nathaniel had insisted upon once the last shadows of Gerald's betrayal had finally been addressed through the completed legal proceedings. Gerald himself now served a lengthy sentence for both his financial crimes and his role in Beatrice's death, while the clerk who had assisted him faced consequences of his own, the full truth finally and permanently established beyond any further question or doubt. Mrs. Whitfield greeted Adeline in the corridor, her earlier guardedness replaced entirely by warm, easy familiarity that had grown steadily since the night she finally found courage to share what she had witnessed years before. The gardens look beautiful this morning, my lady, she said, smiling. His Grace has been out since dawn, helping arrange the tables for this afternoon's celebration. Adeline made her way outside, and found Nathaniel exactly where Mrs. Whitfield had described, sleeves rolled up as he helped servants arrange long tables beneath the same trees where he had once sat alone, carrying grief he believed he would never fully escape. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into the easy, genuine smile that had become so familiar over the past year, nothing at all like the guarded composure that had greeted her on her very first evening at Ashcombe. You look happy this morning, she observed, settling beside him as he finished arranging the final table. I am happy, he said simply. It has been a long time since this house hosted a celebration, rather than simply enduring another day beneath old suspicion. I find I have almost forgotten how such gatherings should feel. Throughout the afternoon, tenants and neighbors filled the gardens of Ashcombe, sharing food and conversation with an ease that would have seemed impossible during Adeline's first uncertain months in the county. Edmund, the elderly farmer whose careful records had proven so crucial during the trial, approached them both with genuine warmth, thanking them again for the justice finally brought to a community that had quietly suffered under Gerald's manipulation for years, without fully understanding its cause. Charlotte, too, had traveled from her own distant home to join the celebration, embracing Adeline warmly upon her arrival. I confess, she said, studying her friend with evident satisfaction, when I encouraged you to seek truth for yourself rather than accepting rumor, I did not imagine you would uncover quite so dramatic a truth as the one you found here. Nor did I, Adeline admitted, laughing softly at the memory of how uncertain and frightened she had felt during those first difficult weeks. But I am grateful, Charlotte, that you gave me the courage to look beyond what everyone else believed they already knew. As evening approached, and the celebration began winding gently toward its close, Nathaniel found Adeline standing alone near the edge of the garden, watching the last golden light of day settle over hills that had once seemed, to her frightened younger self, impossibly foreign and threatening. He came to stand beside her quietly, following her gaze toward the horizon. A year ago, he said softly, I stood in this same garden believing I would spend the rest of my life carrying suspicion and grief with no hope of resolution. I did not imagine, when my family arranged this marriage out of practical necessity, rather than any expectation of genuine connection, that I would find in you not merely a wife bound to me by circumstance, but someone who would fight so fiercely alongside me, for truth I had nearly given up hope of ever finding. And I did not imagine, Adeline replied, turning to face him fully, that the man everyone warned me to fear would become the person I trust most completely in this world. He reached for her hand, holding it gently, as the last light of day faded into the soft blue of early evening, stars beginning to appear scattered across the darkening sky above Ashcombe. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly, echoing the very question he had whispered to her on their wedding night, a year before, when they had still been strangers, bound together by circumstance rather than genuine understanding. Adeline smiled, remembering that first uncertain night, the courage it had taken to answer honestly despite everything she had been told to fear, and the long, difficult journey that had followed, ultimately leading them both to this quiet, peaceful moment in the garden they now shared as genuine partners, rather than simply husband and wife bound by arrangement. "No," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet certainty it had held that very first night, though now deepened by everything they had faced and overcome together. "I have never been less afraid, Nathaniel, than I am standing here beside you tonight." He drew her closer, and beneath the gathering stars above Ashcombe, the house that had once been shadowed by rumor and unresolved grief, finally settled fully into its new identity. Not a place to be feared, but a true and lasting home, built not on the whispered warnings of those who never truly understood what waited within its walls, but on the hard-won trust between two people who had chosen, again and again, to face difficult truth together, rather than allow fear to define what they might have shared. And as the festival lights flickered gently across the gardens behind them, and the last guests began their journeys home beneath a sky full of stars, Adeline understood, with quiet and complete certainty, that whatever challenges the future might yet bring, she would face them exactly as she had faced everything since her arrival at Ashcombe, not alone, and not afraid, but standing firmly beside the man everyone had warned her to fear, and whom she had, against every expectation, come instead to love.